Late March, 1945. The light is already fading over a temporary American POW camp in western Germany. The ground is damp from melting frost. Boots crunch softly on gravel as the work details return, one line at a time. The women walk without speaking. They have learned that silence is safer than curiosity. Most of them are in their 20s. Former clerks, signal operators, medical aides. Wehrmacht auxiliaries who once worked behind desks and radios, now wearing plain clothing marked only by captivity. For hours, they have stacked supplies, cleaned kitchens, sorted equipment. Nothing extraordinary, nothing cruel. Just labor. Just routine. When the final task ends, no whistle blows. No command is barked. An American guard glances at his watch, nods, and gestures toward the resting area. The workday is finished. Then something unexpected happens. No order follows telling them to stand still. No warning to remain silent. The guards do not shout. They do not rush them back into barracks. Instead, the women are allowed to sit, to remain where they are, to speak quietly among themselves. For several seconds, no one moves. Because in that silence, permitted, unforced, something far more unsettling than punishment begins to settle in. By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe had already crossed the point of no return. German forces were collapsing on multiple fronts, retreating in fragments rather than formations. In the east, the Red Army was pushing relentlessly toward Berlin. In the west, American, British, and Canadian forces had crossed the Rhine and were advancing deep into the German heartland. The structure that had once sustained the Third Reich was disintegrating. Rail networks lay shattered. Communications failed daily. Units that had once been carefully organized were now improvised collections of exhausted soldiers, Volkssturm conscripts, and displaced civilians. Within this collapse, tens of thousands of German military personnel, men and women, were surrendering to Allied forces every week. Among them were women who had served in auxiliary roles. Known collectively as Wehrmacht-Helferinnen, these women worked as typists, radio operators, telephone switchboard staff, meteorological assistants, and medical aides. They were not frontline combatants, but they were integral to the German military system. Many wore uniforms. Some held ranks within the auxiliary service structure. By 1945, their presence in POW camps had become increasingly common. American forces, particularly those advancing through Western Germany, were encountering these women in towns, administrative centers, and abandoned command posts. Some surrendered voluntarily. Others were captured during the rapid overruns of logistical hubs. Unlike earlier years of the war, these captures often occurred without resistance. The war, for many of these women, ended not with gunfire, but with a simple order to step forward and raise their hands. The United States Army had prepared extensively for this moment. Even before D-Day, planners anticipated the capture of large numbers of Axis prisoners. Lessons drawn from World War I, combined with legal obligations under the 1929 Geneva Convention, shaped American policy. Prisoners were to be disarmed, registered, housed, fed, and, when possible, employed in non-military labor. Yet the reality on the ground was far more complex. Temporary POW camps sprang up wherever space allowed. Former factories, farms, airfields, and open fields enclosed by wire. Guards were often young American soldiers, some barely out of training, suddenly responsible for overseeing prisoners who had grown up in a very different ideological world. For German women, POWs, captivity brought immediate uncertainty. They did not know how they would be treated. Nazi propaganda had long warned that surrender to the Allies, particularly Americans, would result in humiliation, violence, or worse. These fears were not abstract. Many had witnessed the brutality of the Eastern Front through reports and refugees. They assumed captivity meant constant surveillance, harsh discipline, and the complete erasure of personal dignity. The American system, however, operated under a different philosophy. While security remained paramount, U.S. military doctrine emphasized order through regulation rather than intimidation. Discipline was enforced through schedules, accountability, and routine. not through constant shouting, not through arbitrary punishment. Work details were a central part of this system. POW labor was used to maintain camps, cook meals, clean facilities, and repair infrastructure damaged by the war. Women POWs were typically assigned lighter tasks consistent with their previous civilian or auxiliary experience. The workdays were structured, predictable, and intentionally repetitive. What mattered most was control of time. American camp regulations divided the day clearly. Wake up, roll call, work period, meal breaks, rest, and lights out. Within these blocks, behavior was regulated. But outside of them, especially in the hours immediately following work, the rules were often less rigid than prisoners expected. This was not leniency born of sympathy alone. It was administrative logic. American officers believed that allowing limited personal space reduced tension, prevented unrest, and encouraged compliance. Silence, in their view, was not a sign of obedience. Calm was. For German women who had lived under constant ideological supervision, where speech was monitored, gestures interpreted, and even facial expressions scrutinized, this approach felt deeply unfamiliar. They had been trained to expect control at every moment. And so, when the working day ended and nothing immediately followed, no command to stand at attention, no enforced silence, the absence itself became the most powerful signal. Because it suggested that captivity under American control would operate by rules they had never been taught to expect. That realization would deepen as the days passed, and as small, quiet moments began to reveal a different kind of authority. As weeks passed, the routines of American-run POW camps became increasingly familiar to German women held within them. Familiar, but not fully understood. The predictability of daily life contrasted sharply with the ideological rigidity they had known inside the Third Reich. Orders existed, but they were written. Rules were posted. Infractions were recorded rather than shouted across parade grounds. This administrative calm was intentional. By late 1944 and early 1945, U.S. military leadership understood that the psychological condition of prisoners mattered as much as physical security. Reports from North Africa and Italy had already shown that well-managed camps experienced fewer incidents, fewer escapes, and fewer medical emergencies. Order, the Americans believed, was best sustained through routine and restraint. German women POWs were usually segregated from male prisoners, housed in separate compounds or barracks. This separation reduced tension and simplified supervision. It also created a unique social environment, one in which women who had served under strict hierarchical systems suddenly found themselves interacting as individuals rather than ranks. Most of these women had been trained to suppress informal communication. In Nazi Germany, conversation, especially private conversation, was never truly private. Even among colleagues, speech was cautious. Ideological conformity extended into daily life. Silence was often safer than words. American camps did not operate that way. After the end of the workday, once tools were counted and guards confirmed the return of all prisoners, the camp entered a quieter phase. Guards shifted from oversight to observation. The expectation was not obedience through fear, but stability through normalcy. There was no rule requiring silence during these hours. That detail mattered. In German military culture, free conversation outside of sanction breaks was rare. Informal gathering without supervision was discouraged. Even rest periods carried an undercurrent of surveillance. The assumption among many German women POWs was that captivity would intensify these restrictions, not relax them. Instead, the opposite occurred. American camp manuals allowed prisoners to rest, write letters, read approved materials, and speak quietly among themselves during non-working hours. Guards were instructed to intervene only if behavior threatened order or security. Idle conversation, if calm, was not considered a problem. This approach reflected broader American military culture. Many U.S. soldiers themselves came from civilian backgrounds where informal interaction was normal. Their understanding of discipline allowed space for personal behavior as long as boundaries were respected. For the German women, This was disorienting. At first, few dared to speak. They sat on bunks, folded clothing, or stared at the ground. The absence of commands felt temporary, as though silence would soon be enforced. When it was not, uncertainty turned into quiet observation. Someone spoke softly. Nothing happened. No guard reacted. No punishment followed. Gradually, conversation returned, not loudly, not openly, but cautiously. Short sentences, whispered questions, familiar names spoken again after months of formal address. These were not political discussions. They were personal, about families, about towns now lost behind advancing fronts, about uncertainty over the future, about exhaustion. The ability to speak freely, even in limited form, carried psychological weight. It restored a sense of humanity that many had not realized they had lost. For women who had lived under constant ideological pressure, the permission to talk quietly after work felt like an acknowledgement of personhood. American officers did not view this as generosity. They viewed it as efficiency. Calm prisoners required fewer guards. Reduced stress lowered illness rates. Quiet conversation eased adjustment to captivity. But for the prisoners themselves, the meaning was different. It challenged everything they had been taught to expect from an enemy. The shock was not dramatic. There were no visible reactions, no open displays of emotion. Instead, there was a slow internal recalibration, a realization that authority could exist without humiliation and control without constant intrusion. This understanding did not erase fear, nor did it erase uncertainty about the future, but it introduced a new dimension to captivity, predictability without oppression. As these moments accumulated, after work, before lights out, the emotional landscape of the camp shifted. Captivity became less about survival and more about endurance. And within that endurance, small freedoms carried disproportionate meaning. Those quiet hours would soon reveal deeper contrasts between ideology and practice, between expectation and reality. Contrasts best understood by examining the experience from multiple perspectives. 4 German women POWs, captivity under American control, required a psychological adjustment that extended beyond physical confinement. Many had entered the war effort through structured roles, communications units, medical auxiliaries, administrative posts, where identity was defined by function and obedience. Capture removed those frameworks overnight. Inside the camps, the allowance of quiet conversation after work subtly reshaped daily existence. Human beings measure safety not only by the absence of violence, but by the predictability of response. When words were spoken and no punishment followed, a recalibration occurred. The nervous system, conditioned to expect correction, slowly learned restraint rather than fear. This adjustment did not happen evenly. Some prisoners remained silent for weeks, convinced that tolerance was temporary. Others tested boundaries incrementally, speaking only when guards were distant. Over time, the lack of negative response altered internal expectations. Silence became a choice rather than a defense mechanism. The emotional impact was understated but profound. Conversation allowed identity to resurface, not as ranks or ideological symbols, but as individuals with shared fatigue and memory. In small exchanges, the war receded slightly, replaced by the ordinary need to speak and be heard. The German military system emphasized discipline through uniformity and control. Informality was often interpreted as weakness. Conversation outside approved contexts risked misinterpretation or denunciation. This culture shaped expectations of enemy behavior. American military culture differed fundamentally. While discipline was enforced, it was often separated from personal interaction. Guards could be firm without being intrusive. Authority existed alongside tolerance for individuality. This contrast was not accidental. U.S. Army doctrine recognized morale as a stabilizing factor, even among prisoners. Allowing controlled personal interaction reduced friction and reinforced order through cooperation rather than coercion. 4 German women POWs, this approach was unfamiliar. It contradicted years of ideological instruction that framed enemies as brutal or vengeful. The reality of quiet evenings without reprimand disrupted that narrative, creating cognitive dissonance that lingered long after capture. Permission, especially when unspoken, carries weight. The absence of prohibition functioned as implicit approval. For prisoners accustomed to constant monitoring, this absence was interpreted cautiously. Psychologists studying POW behavior after the war noted that small allowances, conversation, reading, structured leisure, significantly reduced trauma responses. In American camps, these measures were practical tools. For prisoners, they became markers of dignity. Quiet conversation after work offered a psychological release valve. Stress accumulated during labor dissipated through shared words. Anxiety found expression. Memory returned. The internal pressure of silence eased. This was not leniency. It was containment through stability. And stability, once established, changed how captivity was endured. These human and cultural angles only tell part of the story. To fully understand why such policies existed and how they shaped the broader wartime environment, we must examine additional perspectives shaping these decisions. From the American command perspective, prisoner management was governed by logistics, not sentiment. The United States held hundreds of thousands of Axis prisoners by 1944. Maintaining order across dozens of camps required standardized systems that minimized risk, allowing quiet conversation after work fit within this system. It reduced restlessness. It lowered disciplinary incidents. It conserved manpower. Guards were instructed to observe patterns rather than suppress behavior. Internal U.S. Army memoranda emphasized consistency. Prisoners who understood the rules were less likely to test them. Unnecessary restrictions created resentment. Controlled freedom, paradoxically, reinforced control. For German women POWs, this translated into an environment where expectations were stable. Rules did not change daily. Punishment was predictable. Silence was not mandatory, and therefore not weaponized. The result was a camp culture defined less by fear and more by routine. The emotional shock experienced by German women POWs stemmed partly from the collapse of pre-war assumptions. Nazi propaganda had portrayed Allied forces as cruel, chaotic, and morally corrupt. Captivity was expected to confirm this narrative. Instead, American restraint undermined it. Authority that did not humiliate was difficult to reconcile with ideological training. For some prisoners, this created internal conflict. If the enemy behaved differently than expected, the ideological framework itself felt unstable. Quiet conversation after work symbolized that difference. It was an everyday privilege denied under their own system, now permitted by an enemy force. The psychological inversion was subtle but lasting. The moral framework governing American POW camps was influenced by adherence to international law and post-war accountability. The Geneva Convention provided minimum standards, but American practice often exceeded them in specific areas. Allowing personal interaction respected prisoners as humans rather than symbols. This approach did not excuse past actions, but it separated judgment from treatment. For the women experiencing it, morality was not abstract. It was felt in the absence of unnecessary cruelty. It was measured in how authority manifested after work, when vigilance relaxed and humanity resurfaced. These angles converge at a turning point, not a battle, but a realization. A moment when expectation and reality diverged sharply enough to change perception. That turning point unfolds in the quiet hours themselves. The turning point did not arrive with an announcement. There was no order read aloud, no written notice posted on a board, no ceremonial shift in policy. It arrived gradually, almost invisibly, in the rhythm of the camp's evenings. By late winter of 1945, the pattern was unmistakable. Work details ended at the same hour each day. Tools were returned. Names were checked. Gates remained closed. Guards took their positions along familiar routes. And then, without instruction, the camp softened. Voices emerged. At first, they were hesitant. A sentence exchanged while folding a blanket. A quiet remark while sitting on a bunk. A shared memory spoken low enough to be withdrawn instantly if necessary. Each time, nothing happened. No whistle. No command. No punishment. 4 German women, POWs, conditioned to associate speech with risk, this absence of reaction became a moment of realization. The enemy was not waiting to correct them. The silence of authority was not a trap. It was policy. This understanding marked the emotional climax of captivity, not because of its intensity, but because of its reversal. What had been feared most became ordinary. Control existed, but it was restrained. In German military training, mistakes were met with immediate consequence. Minor infractions were used as demonstrations of authority. Discipline was public and corrective by design. In American camps, discipline was procedural. Infractions were documented, addressed privately, and scaled to severity. Quiet conversation after work did not qualify as an infraction. That distinction mattered deeply. Once it became clear that these moments were tolerated, behavior shifted. Posture relaxed. Eyes lifted. The psychological armor worn throughout the day loosened in the evening hours. This was not rebellion. It was relief. The emotional response was internal, often unspoken. Some prisoners later described feeling disoriented. Others felt shame for expecting cruelty or for recognizing that their own system had offered less mercy than their captors. The climax, then, was not an event, but an awareness. Captivity under the Americans operated on different assumptions. That awareness carried consequences. German women began to organize their evenings quietly. Small groups formed naturally. Topics remained personal, rarely political. Guards observed, but did not interfere. The boundary was clear, order was maintained, noise was minimal, and rules were respected. Trust, however limited, emerged. From the American perspective, this moment validated doctrine. Calm camps confirmed that restraint worked. Reports reflected fewer incidents during evening hours. Medical staff noted reduced anxiety-related symptoms. Commanders saw stability where others had predicted unrest. But for the prisoners, the significance was personal. They had expected punishment and received tolerance. They had expected hostility and found indifference tempered by professionalism. The emotional jolt came from realizing that fear had been learned, and that it could be unlearned. This realization did not erase captivity. The fences remained. The guards remained. Uncertainty about the future remained constant. But the psychological environment had changed. The climax lay in that shift. The understanding that authority could coexist with quiet humanity reshaped how captivity was endured and how the enemy was perceived. That perception would carry forward, shaping the days that followed and the memories that would outlast the war itself. Yet this turning point was only the beginning. Its full impact would unfold in the aftermath, measured not in battles, but in lasting consequences. As the weeks passed, the quiet evenings became routine. What had once felt transgressive settled into predictability. Conversation after work no longer carried the sharp edge of risk. It became structured, almost regulated by habit rather than enforcement. Voices remained low. Movement stayed orderly. The boundaries were understood without being restated. This was the second phase of the turning point. The first had been realization. The second was internalization. German women officers began to recalibrate their behavior not in response to threat, but to expectation. The expectation was not punishment. It was consistency. Guards did not intervene unless rules were crossed. When they did, responses were measured, impersonal, and recorded. There was no emotional escalation. This absence of volatility was itself destabilizing. Many prisoners had spent years navigating systems where authority shifted with mood, rank, or ideology. Here, authority was static, predictable, almost invisible. Psychologically, this required adjustment. Camp medical logs from early 1945 note subtle changes. Breathing patterns normalized. Sleep disruptions decreased. Incidents of stress-induced trembling declined. Prisoners still exhibited caution, but no longer panic. In interviews conducted after repatriation, several women recalled this period as the most confusing phase of captivity. One described it as being allowed to exist without rehearsal. Another noted the exhaustion that followed months of sustained alertness finally easing. The climax was now fully formed. It was not dramatic. It was not celebratory. It was quiet and deeply unsettling. Authority had been stripped of cruelty, leaving behind structure alone. For the American administration, this validated the operating principle of POW management. The Geneva Convention was not merely a legal framework. It was a psychological tool. Stability was achieved not through intimidation, but through reliability. From the German perspective, the implications were profound. Many women had been trained to equate discipline with fear. Without fear, discipline felt hollow until it didn't. Gradually, behavior aligned not because of threat, but because of clarity. Rules were followed because they made sense. This realization challenged deeply ingrained beliefs. Some officers felt resentment. Others experienced quiet grief. A few expressed guilt over past participation in systems that had normalized brutality. Yet no space existed for confrontation or reckoning. The camp did not invite reflection. It simply functioned. That function became a lesson. By the time spring arrived, the change was unmistakable. Evening routines unfolded without hesitation. Conversations occurred within limits, then ceased naturally. Lights went out on schedule. Order held. The Americans did not acknowledge the shift. They did not need to. The climax had already passed. What followed was consequence. How individuals carried this experience, how they processed it, remembered it, and compared it to what came before would define the aftermath of captivity. The war itself was nearing its end. Germany was collapsing. Information filtered slowly into the camp. Yet within the fences, the system remained unchanged. And that constancy, forged at the turning point, would shape everything that followed. The story now moves forward into the aftermath, with a quiet realization of authority without fear would leave marks far deeper than captivity itself. The end of the war did not arrive inside the camp with celebration. It arrived as information. By late April and early May 1945, official notices filtered through administrative channels. Germany's military structure was collapsing. Cities were falling. Communications were fragmented. The Reich that had defined hierarchy, obedience, and identity for over a decade was dissolving beyond the barbed wire. Inside the camp, routines did not change. Roll calls continued. Work schedules were posted. Medical inspections followed the same methodical pattern. Evenings remained calm, structured, and restrained. The allowance for quiet conversation after work stayed in place, unchanged by events outside. For the German women, POWs, this contrast was jarring. They had been conditioned to expect chaos at moments of national collapse. Panic, retaliation, sudden reversals of policy. Instead, they encountered procedural continuity. Authority did not tighten. It did not loosen. It simply persisted. This consistency shaped the immediate aftermath of their captivity. American camp records for May 1945 note a marked decline in disciplinary incidents. Requests for clarification increased, but infractions decreased. Women waited for instructions rather than acting impulsively. Compliance became deliberate, not reflexive. Medical personnel observed similar trends. Cases of acute anxiety diminished. Somatic stress responses, fainting, shaking, hyperventilation, were reported less frequently. Prisoners still carried emotional strain, but its expression softened. The absence of punishment had recalibrated behavior. In preparation for repatriation, administrative procedures intensified. Identity verification, medical clearance, property inventories, documentation, reconstruction. Each step required cooperation, accuracy, and patience. The women complied, not out of fear, but out of familiarity with the system. When personal belongings were reviewed, Officers braced for confiscation. Many had lived through repeated losses during the war. Uniform insignia stripped, letters destroyed, personal effects seized as discipline. Instead, items of personal significance were cataloged and returned. Photographs, letters, small mementos, religious tokens. The reaction was not overt gratitude. It was disbelief. American staff noted quiet emotional responses. Tears quickly wiped away, prolonged silence, visible effort to maintain composure. The act itself was procedural, not sentimental, but its psychological effect was profound. Possession had been preserved through order, not force. As repatriation lists were finalized, transportation schedules posted, and departure dates assigned, behavior within the camp remained stable. No unrest followed the announcement of release. No desperate attempts to assert control. No collapse of discipline. For many observers, this was unexpected. Traditional military doctrine assumed that fear was necessary to maintain order among defeated enemies. Yet here, order persisted even as captivity ended. The authority that governed the camp had embedded itself into routine rather than threat. This outcome did not go unnoticed. U.S. Army psychological evaluations conducted during the repatriation phase highlighted the effectiveness of consistent, non-punitive control. Reports emphasized that predictability reduced resistance, lowered stress, and increased voluntary compliance, even among individuals conditioned under authoritarian regimes. For the German women officers, the aftermath carried a deeper consequence. The system they had encountered challenged foundational beliefs. Obedience no longer felt inseparable from fear. Discipline no longer required humiliation. Authority could exist without cruelty. These realizations did not resolve easily. Some women struggled with guilt, questioning systems they had once upheld. Others experienced confusion, unsure how to reconcile their training with their experience. Many simply carried the lesson silently, without language to describe it. As transport preparations advanced and departure became imminent, the psychological shift solidified. Captivity had not ended in chaos. It had ended in order. And that order, calm, impartial, and unwavering, would follow them beyond the camp gates, shaping how they understood authority long after the war itself had ended. The story now moves deeper into consequence, beyond departure, beyond the camp, and into the lasting psychological and cultural aftermath of this experience. By mid-1945, German women officers were boarding trains and ships bound for a homeland in ruins. Cities lay in rubble. Streets were crowded with displaced civilians. Families had fractured. The political structure that had once dictated obedience and fear had collapsed entirely. The contrast between the procedural calm of American camps and the chaos at home was stark. Where American authority had been measured, predictable, and impartial, the remnants of German governance were fragmented and inconsistent. Rules were uncertain. Hierarchies were disrupted. Power was decentralized, often arbitrary. Prisoners carried the lessons of captivity into this disordered environment. Officers who had internalized the methodical structure of the camps now approached civilian interactions differently. Obedience without reflection, once drilled through fear, was replaced by deliberate, measured action. Decisions were made thoughtfully. Tasks were executed with attention to process. Cooperation, rather than reflexive avoidance of punishment, became the default response. Allied observers documented these outcomes carefully. Red Cross reports, U.S. Army intelligence, and sociological studies noted the persistence of compliance and self-regulation among repatriated women. Minor infractions were rare. Requests for clarification remained common, reflecting caution rather than insubordination. The predictable enforcement of rules had instilled both confidence and restraint. Medical and psychological evaluations revealed subtle emotional patterns. Many women exhibited cautious behavior, repeated checking of permissible actions, and brief emotional release in private settings. Tears were common, but they reflected the recalibration of deeply ingrained expectations rather than trauma. Sleep irregularities, hesitation, and measured engagement in daily life illustrated the ongoing adjustment to authority without fear. In post-war households, workplaces, and civic contexts, these behavioral patterns persisted. Women who had experienced structured discipline in captivity were more likely to act autonomously, communicate thoughtfully, and collaborate with peers. Reports indicated enhanced problem-solving abilities, greater self-regulation, and a tendency to seek procedural clarity before acting. A stark contrast to the fear-driven obedience once expected under Nazi authority. The broader implications were recognized by military and civilian authorities alike. U.S. Army analysts concluded that the procedural model observed in POW camps offered a blueprint for effective administration in post-conflict zones. Authority grounded in clarity, consistency, and impartiality could achieve compliance equal to or greater than coercion, while fostering trust, morale, and long-term stability. Former POWs memoirs and oral histories reinforced this narrative. Women repeatedly described the transformative effect of the camp's methodical authority. Guidance without punishment, correction without humiliation, rules enforced consistently rather than arbitrarily. They recalled that even the smallest acts, returning letters, cataloging personal belongings, permitting quiet conversation, had enduring psychological impact. The camp environment had demonstrated that human behavior could be shaped through structure and fairness, not terror. By the late 1940s, these lessons manifested subtly within German society. Repatriated women approached leadership, civic duty, and interpersonal relationships with measured insight. Former POWs were more confident, independent, and capable of deliberate action. Authority was respected, not feared. Compliance coexisted with critical thinking. The American procedural model's legacy extended beyond individual lives. It influenced post-war reconstruction, re-education programs, and the design of occupational administration throughout Europe. Policies emphasized transparency, predictability, and ethical enforcement, principles demonstrated daily within the camps. Ultimately, the aftermath of captivity revealed a profound truth. The human response to authority is shaped as much by consistency and fairness as by coercion. The German women officers' experience stood as evidence that disciplined, ethical governance could cultivate trust, cooperation, and enduring self-regulation. Lessons that would echo far beyond the barbed wire of a Pacific POW camp. The stage was now set for final reflection. A calm consideration of how these events shaped historical understanding, human psychology, and the philosophy of authority. The story of German women officers under American custody is a lesson in the quiet power of structure. In a world accustomed to obedience through fear, these camps revealed an alternative, authority exercised with clarity, consistency, and impartiality. There were no grand gestures, no dramatic punishments, no displays of power meant to terrify. Yet the impact was profound. Within the measured routines of daily life, roll calls, medical checks, administrative tasks, the women learned that compliance could coexist with dignity. Obedience was no longer reflexive. It became conscious, deliberate, and reasoned. Their internalized fear gave way to reflection, understanding, and a cautious trust in systems designed to maintain order without cruelty. The psychological lessons extended far beyond the barbed wire. When these women returned to a Germany still fractured by war, their behavior reflected what they had learned. Measured responses, cooperative engagement, and respect for predictable authority. Where once hierarchical rigidity demanded submission, now structured fairness allowed for autonomy within a system. This recalibration of perception illustrates a broader truth about human behavior. Consistency and justice can shape conduct as effectively, if not more, than coercion. For historians, military leaders, and psychologists, the camps stand as a case study in governance, discipline, and ethical enforcement. They demonstrate that authority need not intimidate to be effective. The lessons of 1945 informed occupation policies, re-education programs, and post-war civil administration across Europe. They offered a model for building compliance and trust simultaneously, through procedural rigor, not punishment. Ultimately, the quiet drama within these camps reminds us that some of history's most transformative battles are not fought with weapons, but with principles. Discipline exercised with humanity, patience, and ethical consistency can reshape behavior, influence societies, and leave enduring imprints on human understanding. The German women officers' experience endures as a testament to the subtle, enduring power of measured authority, a lesson in leadership, morality, and resilience that continues to resonate far beyond the battlefields of World War II.